Well, welcome. Today is the first week of our Christmas Advent series for 2021. And the focus of the first week of Advent traditionally is a focus on hope. And the first candle that we lit this morning represents hope. And it is the hope that comes from God. And we'll be looking at that for sure. And that's the theme of this morning. And I got to tell you, though, I love Christmas. I really love the whole Christmas season. And that's why I like doing the whole Christmas season. There were years in my life when Christmas would sneak up on me, like before I ever knew it, Christmas was there and gone, and I feel like I kind of missed it. But I imagine if we were to compare notes of when we were children, our Christmas experience was probably kind of similar. As adults, I think our Christmas experiences are very, very different because people celebrate Christmas in different ways. I once celebrated Christmas 700 feet under the ocean with a bunch of guys on a submarine. I wouldn't recommend that, but people travel and they go and they visit family. Some people they have a tradition of going to the movies, go to a movie theater on Christmas Day. Some people stay home and play games and eat. That's more my style, right? And it's just true. We celebrate Christmas differently as adults. However, I also think that if we were to compare our Christmas experiences as kids, back when we were just little kids, those experiences, they would probably have a lot in common. Do you actually remember when you were a young kid, the Christmas morning to actually arrive? Like it just couldn't get here fast enough, right? Counting down the days till Christmas. Maybe you had a countdown calendar or an Advent calendar that would count down the days leading up to Christmas morning. It was so special. As a child, it just took forever, though, for Christmas to come and actually get here. Why was that? Why was it like that as a kid? The last few days especially. The last few days before Christmas, they were agonizingly slow, weren't they? It just took forever. The longest day of the year was the day before Christmas. And then you become an adult and somebody says, hey, it's 2 weeks till Christmas. And now you're like, oh my gosh, really? Isn't that weird? As a kid, it took forever. But as an adult, it just comes so quickly. I looked it up this morning so you don't have to worry. We're just under 4 weeks till Christmas. So you still got some time. The adults go like, oh no. And kids are like, oh yeah, we're getting close. It's getting close now, right? We were kids looking back. It was so agonizingly long from one Christmas morning to the next. But the great thing about it, the great thing about that experience was that no matter how slow that season went, no matter how slow how long it took to get to Christmas morning, no matter how long it seemed to take for Christmas to actually arrive, we always got there, didn't we? There always was Christmas morning. No matter how long it took to get to that moment, there always was Christmas morning. It's always there. It's been a part of your life every single year of your life. During that time, we all probably did something else in common, and it's confession time. I want you to know it's okay to confess. Confession is good for your soul, and it won't leave the room. So, we're all friends, right? So we can confess to each other. How many of you guys will admit that you actually look for the presents that your parents had bought for you and they stashed somewhere in the house? Raise your hands if you look for. Yeah, we did, right? That's what you do as a kid. Did anybody actually find the present? You found him? You took him out of the box and you played with him? And then you broke it? What do you do now? Yeah, you put it back in the box and you hide it again. And Christmas morning you open it up and you go, oh, Mom, it's broke already. And you'll hope she has the receipt, right? So you can fix it or whatever. What's interesting to me, though, is that, and I want you to really think about that. Remember when you were anxious for Christmas morning, that dynamic of waiting that we were just talking about, that we all experienced waiting for Christmas morning to actually arrive, is the very same dynamic of the very first Christmas ever. You might know this, or this might be new information for you guys, but for generations upon generations, for a long time, for thousands of years, there was always a handful of people. There was a group, or what we sometimes call a remnant of faithful people who waited every single day of us, or for the arrival of Christmas decorations or anything like that, but they were waiting for the arrival of the Messiah, the Savior of the world, the promised Savior of the world. And in every single generation, from the time the promise was given all the way, there was always a group of people that lived their lives literally like the very next day could be the day that he arrives. And they lived their lives in obedience to God's commands, knowing that, it could happen. Any day now, the Messiah could arrive. We've been waiting for a long time, but this could be the day. This could be the morning that the Messiah shows up. But unlike our certainty of Christmas morning, this morning for every single one of us, their waiting went on and on and on for a really, really long time. For generation, literally generation after generation, yet nothing happened. And you think about it, for 99.9% of those people who waited and waited and waited for the coming Messiah, they died. And there was no fulfillment. There was no Christmas morning for them ever in their lifetime. And listen, they prayed. I mean, they were faithful people, right? These are people who are hoping and wanting, and they prayed and they remained faithful. And while many people in Israel, after a few thousand years, they kind of trailed off in other things, and many people actually abandoned their faith in the Messiah and thought, well, this just must have been a fairy tale. This must have been like some kind of myth or something, because we've waited for 1,000 years or 2,000 years and nothing happened. And I mean, look, I get it. I can understand how that would happen. Who in the world would devote their entire lives to a story that, is honestly a couple of thousand years old? Why would we still believe in that? Who would hang on to a promise that had been given 2,000 years ago and think that it's still possible, that it's still coming? Many of them just thought, bah humbug. It's just, forget it. It's over. What a waste of time. But even with that, like I said, there was always a group of people. There was always a group that was waiting, a faithful remnant that got up every single day as if this could be the day that the Messiah comes. There was always a group of people hanging on to the hope of that promise, that the Messiah would actually show up. And today, as we begin our Advent series, rather than just tell you the story of Christmas, which you know by heart anyways, I want to talk about that hope that they had. Because I'll tell you right now, in our world, we are in desperate need of hope. There is a real need for hope in our world today. People are without hope. Not only in the world, here in our community, here in our church, there are people who are losing hope. And we want to find that hope. We want to hang on to that hope. So today I want to focus on two of these people who were faithful, two of these people who were the remnant. They were holding on. They were living every day in anticipation that the Savior could arrive any day now. If you have your Bibles, you want to follow along. We're going to be in the book of Luke exclusively this morning, in chapter 1. This is in your notes, but here's why. I want to tell you why this is so relevant for you this morning, right now, here in 2021. Because, as I said, the world is in desperate need of hope. We need something to hang on to. We need to recapture that hope. And at some point in your life, in your Christian experience even, if you haven't had this already happen, I can guarantee you that it will in your life. In fact, you maybe will experience this more than once at one time, but at some point in your Christian experience, you will begin to feel like, you know what? It seems to me, from my standpoint and from my perspective, God is very, very distant. I just can't find him. It's like he's not even around. It seems like God in your life is very inactive. Like God just doesn't care. It feels like God doesn't care. And God is so silent in your life, and you're desperate to hear from him. There will be times in your life when you will look around as a Christian and you'll begin to think, why am I even doing this? Why do I continue to practice my faith? Why do I go to church? Why am I serving? Why am I giving? Why am I still believing? Why am I obeying? Why in the world am I continuing to do this day after day, week after week, to live my life as if there is something more in life than this life? Why am I holding on to this faith thing anyways? Why am I believing that there's something to the Bible? Why am I believing that there is a God anyways? I mean, am I just playing along because my parents taught me to believe this way? Is this simply something that we do as a tradition? Or is it my fear that if there is a God, he'll punish me if I don't? Is that why I act out on my faith? Or is this kind of more of a superstition? Or do I really, really believe? These are questions that will hit you at times. At some point in all of our lives, there are going to be periods of times where even with our attempts to be faithful and good Christian people, we will begin to feel like God is very, very distant in our lives. What's the deal? Why am I doing this? Is there anything to this at all? And if you've ever had that thought or that question, or maybe you're in one of those periods right now, maybe this is a moment where you're feeling like that, then the Christmas story is for you. In fact, the Christmas story that surrounds these two people, Zachariah and Elizabeth, we're going to look at them today. In some ways, it's their story, but it's also your story. And it's my story too. This is a story for all of us. Here's how it begins. Luke chapter 1, starting in verse 5, says this. In the time of Herod, now this is the Herod, if you know the Christmas story, this is the Herod that ordered that all of the babies in Jerusalem in Bethlehem be killed, because he was trying to stop the arrival of the Messiah. He wanted to remain king. He didn't want anybody taking his place. So in the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife, Elizabeth, was also a descendant of Aaron. This just means that Elizabeth and Zechariah, they were like preacher kids. They were like preacher kids from a long line of preachers' kids. These were the tribes that were responsible for being priests and conducting the services. They were descendants of this long line of what we consider holy kind of religious leaders or priests. They belonged to that lineage. That was passed down to them. It's kind of where we pick up some tension here in the story, because Luke goes on to say that both of them, both Zechariah and Elizabeth, they were righteous in the sight of God, observing all that the Lord's command and decrees. And they did this blamelessly, which means when God looked down at them, he smiled, right? And he said, these guys are getting it right. These are good ones. These two people, they're doing everything God expects them to do in their life. It's clear they're doing everything right, because it says here that they were observing all of the Lord's commands blamelessly. How many of you guys feel like God looks down and sees you as righteous and blameless? I don't either, right? But that's how they were. These were really, really good people. I mean, we don't even like to read through most of these religious commands that they had to follow, because they're confusing and they're complex and restricting, and they don't really apply to us today in the New Testament anyways. But here's a couple of people. What we need to know is here's a couple of people, and they're doing it right. They are the good examples, right? And so if you hired a private investigator to look into them, if you were going to investigate their life, if you're doing a background check on Zechariah and Elizabeth, if you Googled them, you would find nothing, because there's nothing to report. They never did, according to this, they did everything right. They didn't do anything wrong. And here's what's really amazing is they were doing all this stuff as priests and as followers of God, based entirely on a promise that had been given a couple of thousand years ago. This is a really old promise. They're still faithfully following that based on a promise that was given a couple thousand years ago. And add to all this the fact that for the last 700 years, and this is important to know, for the last 700 years before these two people lived, God had done absolutely nothing for the nation of Israel. God hadn't spoken to them. God was silent. God seemed distant for 700 years. And yet these two people, this is their story. They got up day after day, and they lived their lives basically as if Christmas was coming every single day. That was their hope. They lived their lives as if the Messiah was actually coming, and one day now, maybe today, he was going to show up. They lived their lives as if God was actually going to keep his promise and fulfill that promise from a long, long, long time ago. This is how their lives unfolded. And again, keep in mind, there's no physical evidence at this point that God is going to do anything. I mean, and he's silent. He had been silent for a long time, and yet they remained faithful. They were faithful people. And so we might look at their lives and wonder, so Zechariah and Elizabeth, all this blameless, righteous living, I mean, certainly God is happy with you. You're obviously good people. How's that working out for you? Look at the very next verse. But they were childless because Elizabeth was unable to conceive. Seems a little strange, doesn't it? I mean, you're getting up day after day, waiting for the long-awaited Messiah, being faithful people, you're serving in the temple, being good people, missing out maybe on other opportunities because you're so tied up in this church thing, and the God that you are so faithful to leaves you childless. And in this culture, it was always the woman's fault. That's why it says Elizabeth was unable to conceive. In this culture, women always got the blame for this kind of thing, never men, because there was no real medical testing, and they didn't know all that much. But it was always the woman who took the blame for this kind of thing. A woman can't get pregnant. Sadly, that's about all women were considered good for a lot of people. And she can't have children. Add to that, there was this whole kind of religious stigma kind of a thing as far as children were concerned. Like God granted children to some couples, and then others, for some reason, he didn't. God chose which child lived and which baby did not. And so for a woman, not being able to get pregnant, not being able to procreate and have children, it was a stigma or a sign that God had cursed you in some way, maybe for something that you had done. Now, we know that Elizabeth was blameless, but for some reason, people looked at her life and they said, God might be punishing you because you can't have children. Throughout her younger years, through her middle years, and now even in her, we find out, latter years, it just wasn't going to happen. She just wasn't going to have children. In fact, look at how this statement ends. It says this, and they were both well advanced in years. They were childless and they were well advanced in years. Like, it's over. I mean, it's too late. You wanted to have kids. And we find out later in the story that, you know what? They had actually been praying about this. They were praying for children. They had prayed the desperate prayers of any couple who wants to have children, but for some reason can't. And I guess God said, no. The answer to their prayers was no, you're not going to have children. So Elizabeth lived with the shame and the pain of this all the way up into her old age. Now, here's what's also kind of striking about this. Their faithfulness to God, I mean, I want you to understand this, and I talked about it just briefly. The entire faithfulness of their lives, like I said, was based on a promise. Not a promise to them, a promise that was made to a guy named Abraham 2,000 years ago. Not 2,000 years ago from 2021, 2,000 years before they were born. Like 4,000 some years ago, this promise was made back in the first century. God had apparently appeared to Abraham. This was the story. This was what they hoped. And here's what God said to Abraham. God appeared to him and said this. Abraham didn't have any kids at the time, but God said, I'm going to make you, Abraham, into a great nation. I'm going to build a nation around your descendants, which by the way, that actually happened. That actually happened, by the way. That came true. And God said, I will bless you and I will make your name great, Abraham. And so, okay, that actually happened too, because most of you guys, you knew who Abraham was. I mean, you know the story of Abraham today, right? So his name is kind of famous. And God said, you know, here's where it kind of starts to break down, though, because God also said, and I will make you a blessing, and I will bless those that bless you. And you know what? That kind of happened for a while. I mean, this promise is kind of unfolded, right? Because that happened. And God said, I will curse those that curse you. And we're still like trying to figure that out. And that may come. That hasn't actually really happened much yet. But then God said, all people, and that's a big word, all people on the earth will be blessed because of you. Through you, Abraham, all people on the earth will receive a blessing. And so this was kind of the root idea that the Jews believed in, and that Israel believed in, and Elizabeth and Zechariah believed in. Because if you know the story, after God gave Abraham this promise, Abraham and his wife, Sarah, who were also childless, they didn't have any kids either, God gave them a son. And that son went on to have more sons, and that kept going. And this whole group of people moved out of Egypt, and they became a nation, the nation of Israel. And they went into their land, what they called the Promised Land, and they began to prosper, and they became an actual kingdom, and things really took off from there. And it looked like maybe that during this story from Abraham moving forward, that God was going to do everything that he told Abraham he was going to do. Maybe this is where God is going to bless all the people of the earth through the lineage of Abraham. Because, you know, as you know, the story goes, there's this king, a really, really good king, King David. He builds this whole kingdom. And then there was the golden age. His son Solomon became king, and for a time things were absolutely incredible. Israel was a world power. There was a time when God was going to leverage the nation of Israel to do great things, and everybody thought this is when the Messiah will appear. It was during this time, because after Solomon, history tells us that everything started to fall apart. And you know the story, it doesn't just keep going up, it actually goes down. It got bad. It got really bad. The nation split into two. There were wars, always these different wars. There were different good kings, but honestly, a whole truckload of really, really bad kings. And between the time of Solomon and up until the time that these two people lived, Zechariah and Elizabeth, the nation of Israel, check it out. Israel, the nation, God's chosen people, they were defeated and they were conquered not once, not twice. Really, this happened 25 different times. They were conquered. I mean, the Syrians defeated them. The Babylonians conquered them. The Greeks took over. The Persians took over. On and on and on it went like that. And after a while, Israel has absolutely no respect and no standing in the world whatsoever. I mean, they were a doormat. They didn't even have an army most of that time. They were exiled from their own homeland for over 70 years at one point. And so this nation of Israel, they became less and less and less a factor in the world. And people began to wonder, well, is God even using these people? So now the idea that somehow the whole world is going to be blessed through the nation of Israel, through Abraham's descendants, a nation that no longer had any strength, no longer had any wealth, no longer had any say even in their own future. The idea that somehow God was going to bless the world through Israel, not only was that not going to happen, it couldn't happen. A lot of people thought it's now impossible. If we were going to be great, it would have been during that time, but now that's over. And so what about the promise? But God, what about the promise that you made to Abraham? How in the world now can this little itty-bitty, often conquered nation ever go on to impact the entire world? People couldn't see how that would ever even happen. I mean, they're just hanging on by a thread to even exist. Nothing good is going to come from this. And so many of the Jewish people during this time, they had turned away from God because God was silent and everything was really, really bad. And they turned away from temple worship, and they began to turn away from even their belief in God. And they just kind of integrated into Greek life and into Roman life because after all, I mean, it's over. Right? The whole, our heyday was a long, long time ago, but not everybody gave up. Like I said, there was always a remnant. There was always a group of people who stayed faithful even when it didn't make sense to do so. And Zechariah and Elizabeth, they didn't do that. And so if you'd walked up to them at this time and you said, you know what, it's over, Zechariah, it's over, Elizabeth, it's just a myth, it's not going to happen, it can't happen. I mean, yeah, granted, some of Abraham's promise kind of came through, and yes, they were a nation, and yes, they did possess their own land for a time, and people know who Abraham was, but Israel will never rise again. And it just won't happen. God changed his mind, obviously. Israel will never be a real player ever again. And so this last promise that all the people of the world will be blessed through Abraham, that probably wasn't going to happen. Nothing could possibly come from this little itty-bitty, dusty part of now the Roman Empire, right? They're not even their own nation anymore. How are they ever going to impact the entire world? This is what people were wondering. Give up. Just give it up. I mean, walk away and enjoy the remaining few years of your life. Pursue something else. Elizabeth, Zechariah, go ahead and enjoy your childless life because that's all there is. Because God, if there ever was a God, it's obvious that he has abandoned you. That's how it felt. That's exactly what their lives were like. And if we'd whispered that in their ear during those difficult years, we would have been so very wrong because God was up to something. The reason Luke begins his story, if you've ever wondered, why does Luke begin the story with this story, is because this was the beginning of something brand new. God was doing something new, something that would result in the fulfillment of God's final promise to Abraham. And so the reason this story is important to you, and the reason that this story is important to me, is because, as I said earlier, there are going to be times, there are going to be periods of life, there are going to be seasons that you go through in life where you feel like God is distant and you feel like God is silent, and we're going to wonder, is it real? Is it really real? Is God listening? Does God hear my prayers? Does God even care about me? And at Christmas, the answer is a resounding yes. Yes, he does. He still cares. Here's how the story plays out. Luke chapter 1. Once when Zechariah's division was on duty, he was serving as a priest before God. He was chosen by lot, according to the customs of the priesthood, to go into the temple and burn incense to the Lord. Essentially, there was a whole bunch of priests. There was a whole tribe, and they were all priests. And so they cast lots. Basically, they had a lottery to decide who would get the honor of going in and burning incense to the Lord. And so, who's the lucky guy this time? And so they draw lots. This is something that maybe happens once or twice in your lifetime as a priest. And so Zechariah is chosen. And so he stands right outside. If you know the Old Testament, he stands right outside the Holy of Holies where God actually dwells, and everybody leaves and he's alone, and he offers incense and he prays directly to God. It's a very, very sacred occasion, and it's a real honor to be chosen. And when the time came, Luke tells us, when the time came for the burning of the incense, all those assembled worshipers, they were outside praying. So he's in there all by himself, And then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing on the right-hand side of the altar of incense. So he's in here and he's kind of doing his priestly thing, trying to be faithful. And suddenly an angel appears before him. When Zacharias saw him, he was startled and he was gripped with fear. Check it out. In verse 13 it says, "But the angel said to him, 'Do not be afraid.'" And this is the standard angel opening remark. If you've ever read the Old Testament or the New Testament, the angels, they just go ahead and right away they do this right up front. They got to get this out of the way. And the reason the angels have to start their conversations with "do not be afraid" is because when people see them, they are afraid. Right? They know, the angels know that people are going to be afraid. So when I hear stories like modern day stories, and people sometimes they'll tell you, they'll say, an angel appeared to them and it was just beautiful and it was just peaceful and, it was a conversation. It was so nice and there was light and I felt loved and everything. Whenever I hear that, I'm like, I don't think so. Right? Because when I read the Bible, and if you read the Bible, when biblical angels appear, you read about it. Everybody who comes face to face with an angel, they fall down on their face like they are dead. They're scared to death almost. And angels, real angels, they're big and they're powerful. And yes, they are scary to us human beings. Even when they're trying not to be scary, they're scary. And so this angel appears, and here's what the angel says. It's kind of awesome. He says, "Zechariah, your prayers have been heard." I would just love to hear that one time. Wouldn't you? I would just love to know, what if God somehow communicated to you, "Hey, I've heard your prayers"? Wouldn't that be enough? Just to know. I can tell you if you have faith and you believe God hears, I believe he does. But wouldn't it be nice to have that confirmation that, yeah, God heard you today? God heard your prayer, just to know that God heard it. So the angel says, "Your prayer has been heard. Your wife, Elizabeth, will bear you a son." They've been praying about having children. They still wanted children, even at an advanced age. And he says, "Your wife will bear you a son, and you will call him John." And this John is going to be a famous John, a really, really famous John. He's going to be who? Yeah, you guys know the story. He's going to be John the Baptist, right? And the angel tells, "He will be a joy and a delight to you. Many people will rejoice because of his birth, for he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He will never take wine or fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God." Why would John have to bring them back to their Lord, the God? Because like I said, many of the people in Israel, after all this defeat and these years and years and years, hundreds of years not hearing from God, and they had turned away. Right? They had good reason to. God hadn't done anything for Israel in hundreds of years. It was like they thought it was just a myth. They thought that maybe the promise had been fulfilled somehow, and they had missed it. They were interesting stories. They passed down these stories. They were really good stories, but the God of Israel had long abandoned them. That's how it felt. That's the reality that they lived in. And then in verse 17, John will go on before the Lord in the spirit and the power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. And then look at this. Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this? You're telling me this, angel, that I'm scared to death of. You're telling me this. How can I be sure it's true?" And he gets kind of diplomatic here in what he says, because he says, "How can we have kids? Because I'm an old man. I know I'm an old man, and my wife is, I'm old. But she's, you got to love the Bible, right?" Zechariah is very diplomatic in how he says this. I know I'm old, but I better be careful because these things get written down and you never know. It's going to come back to, I don't want to say she's old, but, she's getting along in years. Can I say that? Maybe she won't get mad at that, right? In other words, he says to the angel, I'm glad you heard our prayers, but really, aren't you a little late? Isn't it a little late now for this problem? We've been praying since, in our 20s we prayed. We were praying in our 30s. We went ahead and just, for the fun of it, prayed through our 40s. We almost quit praying, but we prayed in our 50s. And now I'm old and my wife she's getting up there. That's kind of what he says here. And the angel said to him, I love this. He said, "Yeah, what do you mean? Why are you asking me this? Do you know who I am?" And the angel declares, he says, "I am Gabriel." We know who this particular angel is. It is Gabriel. And he says, "I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and tell you the good news. And now, smarty man, you will be silent and not able to speak." You want a sign? I'll give you a sign. You won't be able to speak until this happens, because you didn't believe my words, which will come true. And this is my favorite part. He says, "At their appointed time." This will come true at the appointed time. Don't miss that part. Folks, don't miss this. God has a particular day for a lot of things. God has particular days marked on a calendar somewhere. It was all planned out. Robert, are you saying that these hundreds of years, I mean, the glory days of David and Solomon, and God then waited on purpose? God was silent on purpose? You mean God watched his people kind of abandon him in droves because it looked like there was no way that any of this promise was ever going to come true? How is Israel ever going to bless the whole world? I mean, they conquered, beat up on for hundreds of years. We're just this insignificant people that are conquered by everybody that comes along. And God has been planning this to happen all along. This was God's plan. You mean there's an appointed time? God actually has the date circled on his calendar when things are going to come up. God hasn't abandoned us? Is that what you're trying to say? And the answer is, yeah, that's right. Yeah, God's timing is not your timing. It doesn't make sense to you, but let me assure you this. It makes absolutely sense to God. You mean that just because God has been quiet, it doesn't mean that God has lost interest in us? Not at all. Not at all. Because at the appointed time, the story goes on. It says, meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah. You remember he got chosen by Lot. He goes in there, he's burning the incense. They're waiting for him to come out, and they're wondering what's taken so long. When he came out, he couldn't speak to them. He's trying, but he can't speak. And they realized somehow through his motions, he kind of told them somehow that he had seen a vision in the temple. He kept making signs to them, trying to communicate with them, but he was unable to speak. When his time of service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant, and for 5 months, she stayed in seclusion. But in her heart, she said, "The Lord has done this for me. In these days, he has shown his favor and taken away my disgrace among the people." Why was she disgraced among the people? Because, like I said, in this time, if a woman couldn't get pregnant, it was her fault. She was cursed by God. So that's her. She knows that everything is changing, and that's her story. But this story, folks, is just a warm-up story for the real story. It's the pre-concert because this is just a conversation before the real conversation when God was going to do something really amazing. This was just evidence that God was gearing up. God was on the move. God was doing something new. God actually had planned to do it all along, and it was not a mistake. Planning to do what those who had remained faithful for generation after generation had hoped that he would do. Those people that had died and never seen the fulfillment of the promise, they had passed on to their children this hope. This hope. And there was always a group of people that held on to that hope. They passed on to their children the hope that Messiah would eventually come. They passed it on to their children, the hope that God, yes, he may be silent right now, but he is still in control. That is the story of Christmas. God is a God that keeps his promises. And that's what Christmas is all about. And in every generation in Jewish life, there was always a group, even though most of them had given up hope, there was always a group that remained hopeful. And they grew up believing it, and they passed it on to their children too. Finally, the day had come when God would put into his plan into action, that Emmanuel would come. Ever since the days of Abraham, they had been hoping, and there was a day that was coming when the Messiah would be born. That every nation on earth would be blessed because of the Messiah being born. That was a fulfillment to Abraham's promise 4,000 some years ago. And here's how the story concludes, and here's how our next story begins. In the 6th month of Elizabeth's pregnancy, God sent the angel Gabriel. Again, the messenger angel Gabriel goes to Nazareth, a town in Galilee, to a virgin that's pledged to be married to a man named Joseph, a descendant of David. The virgin's name was Mary. We're going to talk about that story next week. But can you see how this story is our story? The dilemma that they were living in, that God would be silent at times, that's our story too, isn't it? Do we believe or do we give up believing because it isn't happening? Do we get involved in church or do we just go do something else on Sunday morning? Do we give or do we just spend ourselves into everything we want because nothing else around us really even matters? Just go into more and more debt. Do we stay in a difficult marriage, or do we do what everybody else does and just call it quits? Are we going to be different people? Do we cheat or do we continue to maintain our integrity? Are we driving home thinking, why am I doing this? Nobody cares. It means nothing. Nobody even notices what I'm doing in life. They laugh behind my back at work because I'm a Christian and I won't do the things they do, and I have these standards, and I'm wondering, why am I doing this? Why do I feel guilty? Why am I racked with guilt when I sin? And why do I think God even cares? Why don't I just do what everybody else does? Why don't I live my life like all those people around? You're sitting alone at night, maybe night after night, thinking, this isn't getting me anywhere. This faith in God stuff is not getting, God's not doing anything for me. God is silent in my life. In every generation, there remains some people that have to decide whether or not they're going to continue faith in God or if they're going to give up all hope. In spite of the fact that God seems sometimes distant and he's not doing anything for them in the meantime, the good news is this. If that's your situation, I want to tell you there's nothing wrong with you. God's not punishing you. If that's your situation, welcome to the common human experience of life, because we all go through this. There have always been people who placed their faith in Christ and they had to decide at some point if they're going to continue to follow, even though there's no evidence or no real logical reason to do so. In spite of what they see all around them, are they still going to be faithful? Welcome to the world of Elizabeth and Zechariah, a couple of people who decided, you know what, even though we don't see any good reason to continue to have faith and hold on to hope, we're going to hold on to hope. Many of us have made that choice too. In spite of what we see going on around us in the world, it's a very hopeless generation, a lot of people would say we are right now. In spite of the fact that we can't even imagine how God will work all of this stuff out in our lives. He has a plan. God is still in control. That's the dilemma that all of us face, or maybe we're facing right now. As we walk with the Lord, the good news is that's normal. If you feel like that, that's normal. There's nothing wrong with you. That's how it is. The challenge is, will you be part of the remnant? Will you remain faithful? Will you hold on to hope? The challenge is, will you be that unique student or that unique couple that is going to continue in the fight every single day to remain faithful? Are you going to be that unique person that says, I'm going to maintain my standards, I'm going to maintain my way of doing life, and I'm going to maintain my integrity, even though the world around me doesn't respect that? I'm going to continue to remain faithful. Because at the end of the day, I need to know that to the best of my ability, I tried to be as blameless as I could be before the Lord. Regardless of whether God ever does anything for me or not, I'm still going to hold on to this idea. And Christmas, the story of Christmas, is a reminder. It's a reminder that your faith in God is not misplaced. It's a reminder that even when God is silent, that doesn't mean that he is distant. It doesn't mean that he's not active. It's a reminder that God does pay attention and is moved by those who remain faithful. God will still keep his promise. Best of all, the Christmas story is a reminder that your faith and hope is not in vain. There is always a hope of Christmas. Christmas is a reminder that our longing and our waiting and our agonizing is not in vain. That God is a God who keeps his promises. And when he keeps his promises, some of them are even impossible. They seem impossible to us for God to work it out, but he does, because he is God. And that's where we place our hope in who he is. We're going to close our service here, and Emmett and Linda are going to come up and we're going to do a closing song. But we're going to give you an opportunity to pray. If you need to pray, if there's an issue you need to pray about, you're welcome to come up here and I'll pray with you. Or if you need to be baptized or you want to join the church, this is the time when we set aside a special time to do those kinds of things. So after they sing, if you guys need to pray, you come on up.